Well, buenos dias and good morning. I've now exhausted of all of my Spanish, so we can get my slides up. Thank you very, very much. I am very excited about being with you here today to share with you a little bit about how the American Public Health Association is trying to meet this challenge of trying to improve the health of our nation and our world. I start by pointing out our strategic map. I'm very visual, so I've gotten my board to understand my impairment with reading, and I just love pictures. So you'll see a lot of pictures today. But as you can see, we are working very hard in the United States, recognizing that we are not necessarily getting the best value for our healthcare dollar. In fact, we're not amongst the healthiest nations. We're also a very competitive nation. And so when we talk about in the United States about being the healthiest nation, it's because we know that we're not, and we are chasing many of our other colleagues to try to get there. And so we're working hard as an association to both improve our public health workforce in the United States and really build a movement, a grassroots movement to try to get the average citizen, my cousin, my aunt, your neighbor, to recognize how important it is to improve their health and also to empower them in a way that gives them the authority to personally intervene. Some of the stuff that we heard from Sir Michael Malmuth this morning about personally getting people to recognize that they have the power to make change. So with that in mind, we've adopted, of course, the World Health Organization's a holistic definition of health, which of course talks about health being a complete physical, mental, and social well-being. And the key word is well-being as part of that, and not merely the absence of disease. We also want to do this in a way which stresses health equity. And so this is our definition of health equity, is when all people, and I mean all, have the opportunity to attain their full health potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving that potential because of their social position or other socially determined circumstances. Now, when you're talking to clinicians, particularly people in the healthcare setting, you have to interpret this for them. And so we talk a great deal when we talk to our clinical colleagues about these four areas that result in health inequities. And obviously, differences in access to care. We're going to talk briefly about that today, both acute and chronic care. Differences in the quality of the care received. Believe it or not, different populations actually receive different quality of care based on where they go or who's taking care of them. That's no surprise to anyone, but you actually have to state that if you want to get that accomplished. Third, individual differences in approach to health or health care. So in the United States, many of my seniors, my grandparents, grew up in an era where cancer was, in their view, a death sentence. And they view it, they fear it. They won't go and get their screening test done because they fundamentally believe there's nothing you can do about it. And we all have people in our country who have tribal elders, depending on who they are, and cultural beliefs around achieving health care and improving their health. And trying to address those. The buzzword for that, of course, is being culturally sensitive. But it's true. It's true that we have to address those differences in how we seek care. And then finally, of course, the social determinants and those differences which all of us really have now adopted as the core of trying to improve health. Now, you can't be from the United States without debating the fact that we're the only industrialized nation in the world that has not yet achieved universal health care for all of our citizens as a fundamental human right. I can tell you that the Affordable Care Act is designed to achieve that in principle. We still have a ways to go, but we are working. We certainly have an amazing healthcare system in the United States. I'm a former practicing emergency physician, and I used to tell people, I used to really get excited when someone would come in with an injury because I knew I could fix them, I could make them better. The challenge is, of course, the more and more I practiced emergency medicine, the more and more I realized that I was simply fixing people that their disease and illness could have been prevented in the first place. And so that was one of the challenges. But when you get sick, and stuff does happen, you need a good healthcare system. And we're really excited, of course, about the healthcare system we have in the United States. And we want to continue to try to make that better. Nonetheless, health is much more than healthcare. And as we say in the United States, place matters. We talk a lot about the fact that your zip code in the United States is more important than your genetic code. And here's a map to certainly demonstrate that, to show you that we have huge differences in terms of where you live, in terms of how long you survive. I didn't put it in this slide deck, but I actually have a map of the Washington, D.C. community, which shows a 10-year difference from where I live to downtown D.C. 10-year difference in life expectancy. And I live about 20 miles outside the city, outside the central city. And that's an amazing difference in life expectancy. But we see that across our nation, and there's all kinds of explanations for that. And we're going to talk a bit about some of those, at least from the U.S. perspective, and a little bit of what APHA is trying to do to change that. Number one, we still believe that tobacco is public enemy number one and the leading preventable cause of death on our planet. And the challenges we have is while we made enormous inroads to tobacco control in the United States, we still have not nearly enough. Still not nearly enough. And it's taken us over, 50 years to get there, in effect. It's been slow, but it's been progressive. And again, we've made enormous progress. But we still have people who initiate, and we still have an industry which does everything that it can to addict our young people at a relatively early age. Second, we know that health is about access to affordable is a key word, nutritious foods. Far too many places in our country still, you don't have a place where people can go and get affordable groceries. For many years, by the way, in Washington, D.C., in the poorest part of the city, there were no grocery stores. There were lots of liquor stores. There were a lot of convenience stores, 7-Elevens and Quick Marks where you could get high caloric, high fat, low nutritious foods, but getting fresh fruits and vegetables was something that was a real challenge. And we're making a big effort through efforts like folks in New York, which have something called a green card experiment. In other parts of our country, we're working to try to work hard to get access to affordable foods in those grocery stores. When I was practicing medicine, I could tell folks, go out and we'll even write you a prescription to remind you to eat well and et cetera. But of course, they would always remind me they had to take 2 buses and walk 5 blocks to actually get groceries that were affordable and nutritious. And that's always a challenge in our communities. Health is about what we eat. This is one of my challenges. I love my sugary beverages, frankly. But it's about how many. It's about how many. When I was growing up, you could go and get a small soda about this size, and that would satiate you. And now, if it ain't 64 ounces, you don't feel like you've had a meal. And that's due to marketing by the industry. And we're working very hard in the United States to try to address this. And the American Public Health Association has worked on looking at good policies like soda taxes and access to nutrition and education to try to get folks to change their behavior around what we eat and how much we eat. We know that health is about external and internal stressors, how we feel about ourselves and a range of things that impact on us. Obviously, racism and discrimination are big parts of that. How else do you explain 2 populations with the same income and the same outside experiences, but when you look at how one group has high blood pressure and one doesn't, how do you explain that without dealing with the stressor aspect of that? We know that it's about water, food, and air. I got to tell you that these three core elements of making sure that everyone in our community has access to safe water, everyone has access to safe food, not just food, but safe food, and working to clean air remains a challenge, even in other parts of the United States. And of course, APHA is very active in those efforts, both on the advocacy side and the policy side, to try to improve that in our country. Health is about where we dump our trash. And far too often, we dump our trash in the poorest parts of town. And then interestingly enough, we clean that up when that land becomes valuable. Usually that land isn't very valuable, and that's why they dump the trash there. But then at some point, that land becomes marketable and valuable, and they clean it up. Unfortunately, far too often, they don't clean it up completely. And then we put other people on top of those old trash dumps, not having properly remediated the land in which we put them there. And we also have the whole issue of illegal dumping, both in low-income communities as well as in our neighbors. Far too often you see illegal trash haulers crossing into communities and dumping their trash into on vacant lots in low-income communities. And that happens not just in the United States, but that happens in other nations as well. Health is clearly about climate change, particularly from the point of view that community resilience is important, and many of our lowest income populations are, of course, disproportionately impacted by climate change. The American Public Health Association has an enormous program trying to point out the impact of climate change and health, to try to make the argument that while we love the polar bears and we're very much concerned about the polar ice caps, what we really are concerned about is the extinction of the human race if we don't get our hands around climate change as quickly as we possibly can, and that the health impact of climate change is enormous, not just on the face of it, but in real term, and by the fact that climate change is here now. And we keep thinking about this as something in the future, but it's very much here now. Samantha talked about this morning about this critical link between education and quality education. We have an organization in the American Public Health Association is working very hard to accelerate and improve the number of our citizens who graduate from high school. There's a strong correlation between high school graduation and your health, and we're working very hard to try to make that happen as a core component of our public health advocacy. It's about the built environment, how we build and plan communities. Now, I live out in the suburbs, and we actually have sidewalks in my neighborhood, but far too many communities in the suburbs do not. And so we ask people to go out and exercise. We even write them a prescription in the doctor's office, go out and exercise. And yet, if they try to do so, they may get hit by a car. They're not street lights so that it's safe, they can be seen. And in many communities, and particularly our urban inner cities, those communities aren't safe. When those kids come home from school, they go into their house and they pick up video games and they play, or they cut on the TV set because it's not safe to go outside. And we know that health is about access to play. You know, we've had this policy debate in the United States about whether or not we ought to spend health care dollars to build playgrounds and to give kids safe places to play. Now, the data that I've looked at shows that kids who are involved in organized play for sure, and kind of disorganized play with supervision, do better in school, have better mental health, and absolutely much better physical fitness. And yet we get pushback from policymakers who think that, well, we shouldn't spend those healthcare dollars. And I would argue with them, of course, and I do all the time, that getting kids into organized play clearly means that those children will be better from a health perspective and better participants in our society as we go further. Now, health is about transportation systems, and I know that's a challenge here in Panama. Several years ago, on my first visit here, I did ride the bus. We'll talk about that later. But we have real challenges. We have great transportation systems in part of the United States, but like many places, we've not really invested in the infrastructure to keep them up like we need to. We need to begin to continue to build transportation systems, not for the convenience of moving cars, but for the convenience about moving people and doing so in a healthy way. We know clearly that people who use mass transit pollute the communities less and are much healthier because they actually have to get out of their car when they park, do the walk to the mass transportation center, and then they get off at the other end and they end up walking to work. They can get their 10,000 steps in pretty easily when they do that. We know about access to quality housing is important. No matter where you will, I always argue, point out to people that I think most of us would prefer to live in the house on the right and not the house on the left. And for those of you who want to live in the house on the left, we can have a therapy session in the back of the room later. But it's an important thing. Housing, first of all, having a house is extremely important, a place to live. But having a high-quality house, one that's free from toxic exposures, one that's free from radon, one that's free from lead in the environment, is extremely important in the community. We've already had the very insightful lesson about income inequality. But I can tell you that's something that APHA hasn't spent a lot of time on it. We're beginning to get involved in healthcare inequality as a social determinant as well. And then thinking broadly about community capacity and resilience. At the end of the day, living in a community that is safe, violence-free, with lots of open space, a place for you to go when someone, as they say, gets on your last nerve, for you to simply sit down and contemplate and be thoughtful, is extremely important. Communities that are walkable, bikeable, and green, as a matter of design for communities, remains essential important challenge for us all. So as I close, I just want to point out that you'll see this is the APHA newspaper. I'll note you to the date. What we're hoping is this is 2030 in January, and what we're hoping is that we'll be able to publish this newspaper on January 1st, 2020, declaring that the American Public Health Association has worked with our partners in the United States and around the world to say that we've become the healthiest nation. I thank you, and I'll be turning it over to the next speaker.